Welcome to another monthly Big Picture episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, where I chat with Pete Wargent. Now, with property values rising for 15 months in a row now, and with talk of interest rate cuts on the horizon, is the Australian property market geared for another boom period of property value growth? Well, there are clues in the news as to what's ahead, and I'm going to discuss this in this month's podcast with leading financial commentator Pete Wargent, who brings decades of perspective to his views. And as always, we're going to be talking about a raft of macro and microeconomic factors that should give you some clues as to what's ahead for our housing markets and interest rates. And we're also going to be discussing why now may be a great countercyclical opportunity to get to the Melbourne property market, which has clearly underperformed over the last year or so. So, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Hi, Pete.
Hi, Michael. Good to see you.
Well, Pete, we're going to see each other face-to-face in a little while at Wealth Retreat. I'm looking forward to that. But I'd like to start off by having a bit of a chat about something that's crept up on us slowly over the last little while, an unexpected turn in Australia's property market. Many people would think that Sydney's Australia's biggest capital city, Melbourne's number 2, or maybe even number 1 if you look at the new wider geographic boundaries of including Melbourne. And so therefore Melbourne's prices were always seen as maybe the second most expensive in Australia. But over the last year, the median house price in Brisbane, well, let's be clear, this is CoreLogic figures and they call them dwelling prices, so there's a reason behind this, but we'll get into that. The median dwelling prices in Brisbane and Canberra are more expensive than in Melbourne, and Adelaide and Perth are now nearly as pricey as Melbourne for the first time in 15 years, Pete.
Yes, you're right. There's definitely a compositional impact here because the median dwelling in Adelaide is most likely a detached house on a decent-sized block of land. It's probably fairly close to the city or the beach, and therefore prices are relatively high. And in Melbourne, well, as you know, there's many more apartments in Melbourne. The median house might be further from the city, or the median dwelling. So there's definitely a compositional impact, and you're not always comparing like with like, but nevertheless, it is pretty interesting. Adelaide's median dwelling price has jumped up to around 734,000 and Perth's around 700,000. These are big increases. I think if you went back to the pre-GFC days, there was a period where Sydney's median price was very close to Canberra and Darwin and Adelaide and actually Brisbane and Melbourne. There were a lot of sort of parity, and I think at one stage Perth was even more expensive than Sydney. And then, of course,
during the mining boom.
Yes, and then Perth had a long flat period. So I definitely think there's a cyclical element to all of this. And at the moment, yes, Perth and Adelaide have had a boom phase. Melbourne is probably due, though. It's been a relative underperformer, I guess, since the beginning of the pandemic.
Yes, it has. Well, I guess it did start in the pandemic, and I remember those years. Well, Pete, it's just a bit scary that was 4 years ago that it started. We were restricted with lockdowns. People left Melbourne as much as they could, and they didn't come to the capital city from regional Victoria. Why would you, if you could walk around in your home town in the regional Victoria, but had to stay home in the capital? But then following from that, there was a number of other factors. The local government was on the nose, let's put it that way. Dan Andrews made a lot of enemies and started taxing anyone and everyone and treating property investors a bit like an ATM. Now, sure, home buyers are not affected as much by that, even though there's now different sorts of land tax. But I think one of the other factors also was Melbourne did 5, 6, 7 years ago have a bit of an oversupply or a sufficient supply of apartments, so we weren't as affected by an undersupply as other cities.
And it's now gone the other way and there's a relative shortage. Yes, I think you're right. Quite often with analyses of property markets, people try to isolate one factor, but it's usually a combination of things. And as you said, Melbourne had some of the world's longest lockdowns for various reasons. The state government got itself into a fair chunk of debt, which is now is trying to be recaptured, I suppose, through land taxes and rising rates and things like that. And there was a bit of an anti-landlord sentiment. So there's a few things that have worked against Melbourne in the short term, maybe over 3 or 4 years. I think if you look back over 2 decades, though, Melbourne's been one of the strongest markets. And I think looking ahead, the state debt, New South Wales had similar issues a few years ago and tackled that through some asset sales, and the world kept turning. I think Melbourne's got the strongest projected population growth over the next couple of decades. And in fact, even today is the largest capital city by population, depending on where you draw the boundaries. So I don't think over the long run there's much to worry about. Just there's been some short-term headwinds, but that's where the counter-cyclical investment appeal comes in.
Well, as you said a moment ago, Melbourne has been the outperformer over the long term. I've got the 20-year statistics in front of me from CoreLogic, and I have in our research department, we've gone back to middle 80s, the earliest Australian Bureau of Statistics data, and Melbourne overall has been the strongest performing capital city, just a little bit more than Sydney, just a little bit more than Brisbane, and those small amounts each year compounding make a difference. Having said that, there isn't one Melbourne property market, there isn't one Sydney or Brisbane market either, so you can't just buy anywhere in Melbourne and hope it'll go up. And in fact, I don't think it'll be a strong performer this year, as strong as Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide. In fact, most other capital cities will do better, but Melbourne turned the corner in January 2023 and is gently growing up in price. Rents are going up as well. But I think it's important to look at the fundamentals and what the local economy is like, Pete, and what's happening with immigration.
Yes, mentioned already, the projected population growth for Melbourne by headcount is the biggest in the country over the decades ahead. The economy, very diverse in Melbourne. You mentioned previously biotech, capital of Australia. A lot of companies had their head offices in Melbourne and Victoria. So big, diverse economy, lots of knowledge workers down there, some of the best universities globally attracting international students. So there's lots to like about the economy over the long run. And yeah, there's been a period of relative price stability for Melbourne. But yeah, this is the way the cycles go. I think periodically some of the capital cities have been laggards, like Hobart was cheap for a time and then it caught up, and then Adelaide was cheap for a time and it caught up. Well, Melbourne's been in the doldrums a little bit over the last 2 or 3 years, but not too much to worry about over the long run, I'd say.
Well, our good friend Stuart Weems has produced some fantastic graphics that show that if you follow each state, they all have periods of years, not months, years, and sometimes even a decade of minimal growth, and then they catch up and they revert back to their mean, and Melbourne's mean price growth has been higher than the other capital cities. But I can understand that it's difficult for somebody to think of buying now. I think maybe it's the wrong time to buy in Melbourne. Of course, if you're buying a home, there's no question about it. It's never going to be cheaper. So why not get into the Melbourne market while you can? What about investments? Well, rents have skyrocketed in Melbourne and there's no way that's going to slow down anytime soon. And if you've got a 3 to 5 year window, basically Melbourne is where Perth was, where Adelaide was 2 or 3 years ago, and it's going to catch up as well. So you've just got to make sure you buy the right type of property, and not just a house. I think family-friendly apartments in Melbourne and villa units in Melbourne, and particularly townhouses where more of us are going to live in medium density dwellings, is going to be the way to go, especially since the cost of new construction is going to be significantly higher, which means when you're buying something today, there's significant inbuilt intrinsic value.
So Melbourne is today where Brisbane was 3 or 4 years ago, where there hasn't been much price performance for units and townhouses over
a decade, to be honest. Well, townhouses, yes. Townhouses are really performing much like houses, but villa units and apartments have been pretty stagnant.
Yes, but then when you look at the cost of construction, for medium density, it's up around 50% since the pre-pandemic days. So the new apartments that come on will be considerably more expensive, and that will underpin the established market. We said this in Brisbane. We had 10 or 12 years of no change in medium density prices, and then they've rocketed, and they are now massively undersupplied in Brisbane. Melbourne's heading the same way, and yeah, there's some, for the right type of property, there's some real good value there. 3-bedroom apartments, townhouses, duplexes, stuff that's got some decent land value component. I think that's going to be a real strong performer over the next few years because, as Stuart has pointed out before, there's a cyclical element to this, and the timing now looks really good because you're buying below replacement cost. So it really is, it's a bit of a no-brainer to get into that part of the market if you've got the budget.
Well, a recent survey by Westpac suggested that 60% of people they surveyed were planning to buy a property in the next 5 years. Australia is obsessed with investment and home ownership, and that's a good thing. And most homeowners will give their second garage to know what's going to happen with interest rates ahead. Earlier this year, a lot of people were hoping they'd start coming down by the middle of the year, but now some economists, most economists, believe interest rates won't fall till much later this year or early 2025. So, Pete, let's have a look at some of the latest data which undoubtedly affects the Reserve Bank's interest rate decisions. One of the things is that our economy doing better than the Reserve Bank was hoping despite all those interest rate rises. We're spending more than we were before.
We are. So if you look at retail turnover compared to 2019, it's considerably higher. A part of that, though, is a bigger population. And another big part of it is anyone who's eaten out recently, gone for a breakfast or a lunch or had to spend on travel or something like that, you'll know that the prices have moved a lot too. In a lot of cases, 50%. So there's an inflation aspect to this. And I think if you go back to around October 2023 to today, well, retail turnover hasn't really changed a lot over that time. So things are slowing down. But generally speaking, things have held up better than might have been expected. If you look at things like mortgage arrears and retail consumption, looking at the US, which is, I guess, the North Star or the guiding light for global interest rates, the unemployment rate in the US is still under 4%. It has been for over 2 years now. So things are holding up pretty well over there as well. So yes, interest rates are still projected to come down in Australia too, but probably not until the final quarter of 2024. And if you look 18 months out, well, maybe 2 or 3 interest rate cuts over that kind of time horizon. But higher for longer is the general theme, just because inflation stuck around a bit, but particularly because the economy has held up better than might have otherwise been expected.
Another way the economy is holding up, of course, is that job vacancies have fallen. The unemployment rates dropped back to the lowest rate since September last year. And that's despite the fact that there's lots more people here in Australia. In fact, there's now more than 14.25 million Aussies employed for the first time, Pete, which you wrote about in your blog, which I enjoy getting every day. And I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to your daily blog because you always come up with some great charts and some great information.
It was a funny employment report that we got last month. So the unemployment rate suddenly dropped unexpectedly to just 3.7%. It's incredibly low. I think almost all of the other indicators, though, suggest that although the jobs market has held up really well, if you look at things like the number of hours worked, the number of job vacancies, everything is softening. And plus, we're seeing, well, we've got record high population growth. So the unemployment rate, as we sit here talking today, is at the lowest since September last year. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see the unemployment rate shooting up from here towards 4.5% or maybe higher. If you look at Canada, that's the potential canary in the coal mine, so to speak, because the unemployment rate there has suddenly gone to 6.1% with very little warning. And there's a lot of similarities between what's happening in Canada and Australia, not just with the housing market, but also they've seen record high population growth over the past couple of years, and the economy just hasn't created the jobs. And I guess that's the risk for Australia is at the moment we've got tremendously low unemployment on the official figures, but I just wonder whether next month and the month after that starts to normalise and then suddenly we could be at risk of a significant softening. So yeah, record high employment, 14.25 million Aussies with a job for the first time ever, which is pretty remarkable when you think about where things were during the lockdowns. It's an amazing rebound. But I just wonder whether most of the indicators and forward-looking indicators are now softening.
Well, one of the other indicators that's come out is a lot of people have got 2 jobs and more people have got part-time jobs. But all these are the factors the Reserve Bank's going to take into account, and there's nothing there to suggest they should even think about dropping rates. Pete, our good friend Andrew Wilson suggests that the international price of oil is a major factor in inflation. And it's not just what it costs you and me at the Bowser to fill up our cars, but it's got a lot to do with transport and logistics. And with the international price of oil creeping up, he thinks that could be a negative influence on inflation moving forward.
Definitely, yeah. I think when you think about petrol prices, it's the biggest influence really on not just on inflation, but also on consumer expectations of inflation. Because when you're driving around Melbourne, it's the biggest price you see every day. It's in font size 100, yes. And you can see every day whether it's up or down. But even just in the medium term, as you mentioned, in the price of production, of course, oil's a key input there as well. So it's not just fuel prices. It's the production of everything, really. And with all the geopolitical tensions around the world, and as demand has held up better than expected, yeah, oil prices have crept a little bit higher over recent months. So that's a key factor for inflation, and of course for petrol prices as well, as you mentioned. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on, but it is partly reflective of this global demand, which is held up better than we might have expected, say, 6 months ago.
Yes. Well, since we last spoke, and we do these big picture podcasts once a month where we talk about all these macroeconomic factors that affect our housing markets, the Australian Bureau of Statistics came out with its latest population figures now. In typical fashion, they're back to the 30th of September last year, and we've seen some other interim figures suggesting that our population keeps growing strongly. But our population grew by 2.5% over that particular year, increasing by 659,800 people. And of course, net overseas migration drove a lot of that, Pete.
Well, most of it really, isn't it? It's over 80%.
Yes.
Yeah, by immigration. I think like globally, developed countries have realised that fertility rates have been dropping. There are very low levels. There's more people choosing to not have kids or maybe just have one. So there's a range of factors. But if you look at New Zealand and Canada and the US and the UK and Australia, they've all gone down the route of pumping up high levels of immigration. And that's partly to tackle the ageing population and also the risk of population decline that does face some countries like Japan and South Korea. So yeah, now you could have too much of a good thing, you might say, because population growth over the year to 30 September of nearly 660,000. Well, we can't build for that level of population growth. That's 2.5%. WA was 3.3%.
Yes.
Victoria 2.9%, Queensland 2.7%. We can't increase the housing stock at that kind of pace. So obviously that's not going to be sustainable. I think you'll probably see population growth will fall back towards 500,000 and then 450 over the next year or two, just as the number of international students normalises. More student visas are being rejected now just to try and take some of the heat out of population growth. But I think the bigger picture trend here is we're growing for 500,000 a year. These are big numbers. When you think about the population of Canberra, well, we've got to add enough housing for that kind of increase every year. You know, it's big, big numbers. So, yeah, a lot of demand for housing, of course.
Another interesting statistic that came out over the last month was that household wealth was up 2.8% in the December quarter. In fact, over the last year, household wealth increased by 7.8% or $1.1 trillion. Now, we know a large part of that's related to people's own homes and, to a degree, investment properties. Residential land and dwellings were the largest driver of that. And it's not downplaying the fact that some Australians are having financial difficulty with all that's going on. So it's actually not evenly distributed, is it?
It's not. Now, as you mentioned, housing is a big chunk of that. About, I guess, 10 trillion or so of household wealth sits in residential property. And we do have, obviously, 3 trillion or so of debt across households. But, you know, this is the big picture podcast. I think the key takeaway here, if you look at the graph that CoreLogic have made of the ABS figures, maybe we can link to that. If you look back to, say, 30 years ago, well, household wealth was under 2 trillion. Now it's 16. You know, it's an enormous increase. And the graph doesn't go up in a straight line because of population growth, but particularly because of compounding. Now, in 2007, when the world ended and stock markets crashed, household wealth fell from about 6 trillion to 5.3. Now it's 16. You know, it's an enormous increase and it compounds over time. So I guess the key lesson here in the big picture podcast being what it is to not interrupt compounding unnecessarily, as Charlie Munger once said. And I guess he's somebody who should know, because his business partner Buffett, at the age of 65, only, I say in inverted commas, had a net worth of around 3 billion. Today it's 138. So he's increased his net worth nearly 50 times since the traditional retirement date. So there's some key lessons there in terms of not interrupting compounding unnecessarily. So we've got about 4 trillion in super and another few trillion in stock markets and currency and deposits. But residential property is really the foundation of wealth for most households.
That's going to be interesting moving forward, because as the baby boomers die off, there's going to be a significant intergenerational transfer of wealth. And some of that's already happening, Pete, with the bank of mum and dad or grandma and grandpa.
It definitely is. We've seen that. I'm sure you've seen the same thing at Metropole. A lot of parents are not that keen on their offspring being stuck in the rental market, not finding stuff that's appropriate. And yes, people with the means to do so are often handing over effectively an early inheritance by saying, right, we'll give you a deposit and we'll help you onto the housing ladder. So I think that's just something that's going to increase over time. And sometimes it's grandparents, as you've said before. So I think that intergenerational wealth transfer is starting to happen, but in some cases it's happening earlier, and people are just passing down the deposits where they can, because who wants to be stuck in the rental market at the moment? It's pretty tough.
Well, you mentioned a while ago the size of the Australian residential housing market and the fact that it's getting close to 11 trillion, and there's $2.5 trillion worth of debt against it. So a very low 23 or so % loan to value ratio. A lot of baby boomers and even Gen Xers have got no debt against their home. I recently interviewed Julie Toth, the chief economist of PEXA, with their report, and I know you mentioned that in your podcast as well, the fact that there was close to 30% of transactions in our East Coast capital cities last year without even a mortgage involved. In other words, people have got a lot of cash, or some people do.
Yeah, it particularly seems to be focused on markets like the Gold Coast, for example, lots of downsizers into that kind of market, but actually all over the place where people are downsizing, or sometimes where there's just a lot of wealth, then yeah, a lot of times people are buying with no mortgage at all, which obviously means that interest rates don't impact that part of the market anything like as much. So there's Australia's household wealth per capita now, or per adult, is as high as anywhere on a median basis. So it's there's a lot of wealth, and we've talked on the big picture before about the factors behind that. Things like record mineral wealth per capita. It's the number one destination for millionaire migrants, and Australia's got a very successful open economic model, big immigration. There's just so many things that are feeding into this, and higher education, international students, tourism. It just makes Australia a very popular and safe destination for household wealth and for people to migrate to as well.
Sure. So the last statistic I'd like to discuss in our chat today, Pete, is the latest housing approval statistics, which fell. Now, just because there's dwelling approvals doesn't mean that these get built. And so when you have a look at it and break it down, dwelling approvals for apartments jump up a bit and down a bit, because each month if a big apartment development gets put through council, it changes the statistics. But if you look overall, we said a moment ago, we're not building enough dwellings. There's not enough in the pipeline to build, even if we could.
The big picture here is you've got land taxes, you've got red tape, higher interest rates, we've got very tight lending assessment buffers, construction costs are up 50%, we've got households paying more rates. There's all of these things working together to stymie new housing supply. The government has said it wants to see 1.2 million homes built in 5 years, but I mean, good luck, because almost everything's pulling in the other direction at the moment. So in February, not even 12,500 dwellings approved. It's nowhere near enough. If you think about, not every dwelling that's approved is going to be built. A lot of them actually just replace what's already there.
Yeah.
I think if you look at units and apartments, which is the more volatile component, as you mentioned, falling dramatically in Sydney. Trend is sharply lower in Melbourne, also in Brisbane now. There's only certain pockets really where units are making sense. Gold Coast is one, I think, because you've got cash buyers, you've got premium developments with water views and things like that, where a developer can make a development work, but overall the supply is very, very low, and it's not really viable for a lot of developers to build at the moment. So building approvals, 162,000 over the past year. That's the lowest in about 12 years. So nowhere near enough to keep up. So you can see why investors are coming back into the market, just because there's a massive undersupply building.
Definitely. Now, Pete, we first got to know each other many, many years ago and then became friends when I read your first book. And I remember I was impressed with it, and I actually asked you, can I sell it on the Property Update bookstore? Then please, could you actually start writing some blogs for Property Update? This was in the early days. When did you come up with your first book?
Gosh, I wrote it in 2011 when I was traveling, and I think it came out mid-2012. So yes, it's a dozen years ago now. Yeah, I've written a few over the years, and next one is due out only a month away. So I've co-authored my next book, which is something a bit new for me, with Kate Bakos, who you know and is based in Melbourne. Yeah, there's one of the industry leaders. She was the REBA president for a number of years.
She's now on the PIPA board as well with our friend Mike Mortlock and Nicola McDougall. So I know how much work and time effort comes into writing a new book. What made you do this?
Well, I guess we figured between us, we've got half a century of combined experience, so we figured we must have learned something worth passing on. I think what we've tried to do differently here is to try and build a book that gives people a framework for making smart decisions in property. Because as you know, it's not like the stock market where you're making decisions here, there and everywhere. In property, you make a few really big decisions, and it's so important that you get those right and get professional help where needed. So we've used a lot of real world case studies and examples of where people go wrong, the traps that people fall into, but also giving people a framework for making good decisions, because over the long run, it can be genuinely life-changing. So the book is The Buy Right Approach to Property Investing, and it's out pretty soon. You can actually pre-order it on Amazon or from Major Street already, but it'll be on the bookstores and in the airports fairly soon.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes to that so people can find out about it, and I'm looking forward to getting my own copy. I'm also going to leave a link in the show notes to your daily blog, and I know if people want to keep in contact with you, you're very active on social media, especially X, the former Twitter. So how do they find you? What's your handle?
Pete Wargent Blogspot's my daily blog, or at Pete Wargent on socials, pretty easy to track down. So always enjoy the interactions, and plenty of info on my free daily blog as well.
Definitely. Well, I enjoy it, and so I look forward to passing the message on by leaving a link in the show notes. Catch up with you in person in a few days' time, Pete, and look forward to at Wealth Retreat, of course, and look forward to having our monthly chat in a month. Thanks, mate.
Can't wait. Looking forward to the Gold Coast. See you there.
I hope you enjoyed my chat with Pete, and if you did and you're not currently a follower or subscriber of this show, just stop for a sec, and on whatever podcast app you're listening to this, just follow the show so that twice a week you get the information from me and my expert guest faculty. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you, but I hope you got the picture from my chat with Pete that we're going to have an interesting year in property. And while we mentioned the Melbourne property market as being a great countercyclical opportunity, and I genuinely believe it is, there are other markets in Australia that are also offering great opportunity, and our research department spends lots of time looking at that. By the way, we don't fly in and fly out like other people. We've got our own on-the-ground teams in the three big capital cities in Australia at Metropole, because we're actually much more than buyer's agents. We actually help our clients with independent, unbiased property and wealth advice, and we actually help them grow intergenerational wealth through property. But it all starts by putting a strategy together for you, because we've got to know where you are, where you want to end up. And we're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but we're still small enough to care. So if you're interested in taking advantage of our markets that are changing, oh, by the way, did you take advantage of the last year or two when the property markets in lots of areas grew by double digits? And are you ready for what's ahead? I mean, the next few years are likely to be very, very different from the last year or two. So if you want to take advantage, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole, book a complimentary obligation-free wealth discovery call, go to metropole.com.au and we'll discuss your individual needs. We've got no properties for sale, and that's why we tailor-make our recommendations for each of our clients. We'll help you formulate a plan or review your existing portfolio. I look forward to being part of your wealth creation journey. metropole.com.au.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Are you waiting for things to change? Maybe you're waiting for things to change so you can be happy. Or maybe you're waiting for things to change so you can finally take action on some of your ambitions. Or maybe you're waiting for things to change so you can get into investment or add to your current investments. For many people, at the moment, life's just a bit too confusing. And for others, it's a bit too busy. Life happens, doesn't it? But in today's mindset message, I want to remember something that was taught to me by one of my mentors, Jim Rohn, who said, for things to change, you need to change. All change isn't growth, though. So just like all movement isn't moving forward, change for the sake of change isn't a good thing. If you find yourself constantly looking for change, then maybe you should actually try focusing on growth instead. I'd like to let you in on a little secret. All growth happens in stages. It doesn't matter if it's in your business or in your personal life or in investments. And in each stage of growth, people are at a point where they can't grow any further using the existing set of skills, the existing knowledge. I've heard it's called the ceiling of complexity, and it happens time and time again at every stage of growth. And as you progress in your growth, you gain experience by solving problems and by transacting business and by doing things. However, this experience comes at a price. Complexity. Each problem you solve, each transaction you make, each hurdle you overcome adds to this complexity to the point where it holds you back from future growth, of being able to be capable, be able to perform properly, to be able to achieve. You just become overwhelmed by the messes, by the stuff, by the complications, by the conflicts, by the contradictions that come from doing things in a certain way for too long. For some, this ceiling becomes a permanent fixture, and that's why many people fail to grow beyond a particular stage of development. But when you've hit the ceiling, there's a smart way of overcoming it. It starts with recognizing that working harder, working longer in the existing stage just isn't going to work anymore. You need a new set of concepts, a new set of strategies to achieve a new state of simplicity. Start again with something simple. By developing a simplified way of thinking, of communicating, of performing, you're going to break through that ceiling. All of this means is you must leave your current state of complexity behind. When you choose your future over your past, you're then going to enter a new stage of growth. So think of your development in terms of goals. Each stage of individual growth comes from having goals, desiring something in life that's new, better or different. Setting higher or more demanding goals automatically forces you to develop new relationships, new structures, new habits. And you can then use those as tools to take you to the next stage of growth. Now, new relationships can provide you with larger opportunities and better results. New organisational structures can give you support you need to achieve those larger opportunities and results. New habits are going to allow you to reach higher levels of performance and achievement that's going to enable you to get there. So, learning how to break through the ceiling of complexity is perhaps the most important life skill that anyone can develop. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast, go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?